You've been doing all the right things. You're crushing your major, stacking internship offers, building your resume, but there's a thought creeping in. What if I'm in the wrong field? And then comes the fear. Does this mean I've wasted all this time? The answer is absolutely not. Let's talk about how to pivot strategically without starting from scratch. In 2025, the reality is, quote unquote, starting over is not really a thing. People reinvent themselves all the time, and it's becoming more and more common. Check out these stats. This is the average number of job changes by age. So if you look at this graph, what you see is that the younger you are, the more likely it is you'll switch jobs. And so the 18 to 24 group here has an average of 5.7 job changes during that time, which is a ton. You're gonna have to adapt to all these different jobs. So change is inevitable, especially when you're just starting out your career. The other thing is the trend of switching jobs more frequently is also increasing. One reason is that companies used to offer pensions and other perks, but as these have disappeared, very few people are lifers and don't necessarily feel super connected to their companies anymore. And so what that means is everyone is constantly reinventing themselves in the workforce. And so if you're in college, it's no different. One of the biggest myths in early career decisions is the idea that switching your major or your path is starting over. That's not how it works. Modern careers aren't necessarily linear, but each experience you have should compound, or in other words, build on top of each other. And every move you've made gives you leverage if you know how to frame it. And therein lies the key. It's about your story. We're gonna come back to that concept, so keep that in mind. You can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backward. Steve Jobs, 2005 Stanford commencement speech. You've probably heard that quote, and the truth is, one thing to realize is that life is messy. This quote illustrates that perfectly. And this is even more true in career pivots. One book I would recommend you read is called The Working Identity by Herminia Ibarra. It talks about how a great number of people reach certain points in their career and decided to completely reinvent themselves and how they did it. Because the how is the hardest thing people deal with. How do you go from spending 20, 30 years in a career and suddenly changing everything on a dime? And as a sidebar, I would also say that this book helped me in my own career in the past when I was trying to figure out early on how I wanted to make a switch. But back to the takeaways. There's one overarching theme from this book I wanted to point out. Most of the people that had to make this switch in their careers, they realized that it was a messy process. People who wanted to switch from a very demanding career, for example, to a more chill or relaxed job, didn't just walk out of their current job one day and into that role. They had to try things out. Some stuff worked, some stuff didn't. It took a year or two, and in some cases even longer. But the important thing is they kept applying pressure in the same direction. And every experience they had, they were learning more and more about what they wanted and what they didn't want. And eventually they figured it out. But it wasn't obvious always. And the outcomes were not cookie cutter. It was very focused around and designed around how these people were living their lives. So you may hear that and think, well, that's sort of encouraging, but I don't want to spend a year or two experimenting to just try to figure out what I want to do. I don't have that time. Well, the good news is there is a way that the author mentions that helps reduce that messiness to some extent. And the secret lies in Jobs' quote from earlier. He talks about connecting the dots. Basically, it's about telling the story of your pivot. The more coherent the story of your pivot, the easier it is for you to execute it and for others to buy into it. And most importantly, it's easier for you to buy into it and imagine what your future could look like. So let me explain that a little bit further. Stories are what bridge us from point A to point B. The messiness I mentioned earlier is that middle portion, the part that doesn't always make sense. And so here's a simple framework I use to pivot smart without losing ground in my own career. So first, recognize where you're at. take inventory of your existing assets. That includes skills, wins, experiences, patterns. Don't throw them away, leverage them. So you may be good at marketing, but you spent most of your career in engineering. And that's kind of my story, actually, to some extent. I dabbled a little bit in marketing at the very early bit of my career. And later on in life, I was in business. And so eventually I decided I wanted to start a marketing firm, marketing to business clients that I was very familiar with. I would not have seen that opportunity if I didn't call back to my earlier career segment where I was actually doing marketing work. All the skills that you've gained in your life make you unique, so don't throw them away. Think about how you can put things together in a different configuration and leverage things. The second thing here is to narratize, which is a weird word, but basically it means to make a story out of. And so how do you do that? You connect your past to your next step. Turn what you've done into a bridge. And so you kind of have to do a little imagining. You have to be like, well, what could future me be doing? What would future me look like? What would they be doing day to day? What would my life look like? What sort of clients would I serve? What sort of a business would I work at? What would my boss be like? The more you can spend time imagining that, the more you can start to think about, okay, well, if I need to be good at pitching people in sales because I really want to be a salesperson in the tech industry, well, today I don't know anything about sales. So how do I get from here to there? Oh, the story would have to be that I went and I spent time reading a bunch of books on sales, or I found a mentor who's in tech sales and they spent the next year teaching me all the ins and outs. See, I'm sort of making this up, but you can see how you got to fill the gap between today and tomorrow. And the third thing is to rebuild. So you've recognized your current assets, you're making a story out of how you can get from A to B, and then now it's time to rebuild, which is to start living out the future with the new activities that make your shift credible to others. So you don't need to start over. Basically, what you're doing is you're stacking your new experiences on top of your existing ones. And so when you do that, what ends up happening is your story and your transition makes sense. One of the biggest questions that is frequently asked in interviews is, okay, why did you pick this company? Or how did you decide on this career path, right? The reason is the employer wants to know, do you think logically about your transitions? It's not that you switched. That's not a problem at all. What they're really trying to figure out is this person deliberate about the transitions they made, and did they use a logical way of thinking to arrive at these conclusions? Now, this is a good framework, but how do you do this in practice? The first thing I would do is to start by listing every skill you've built. So this goes back to the recognize portion, right? Ask yourself, what tools do you know how to use, software or otherwise? What roles have you played in projects, in school or work? What results have you contributed to? And so those are a couple questions. You can imagine more, but try to exhaust the skills that you have so you have a good idea of what you're good at. Then list your soft skills and preferences. So the hard skills, maybe you know how to do 3D modeling, but then a soft skill may be something like, oh, well, I'm really good at public speaking. And so in that vein, here are some examples of questions you can ask yourself. Are you a fast writer? Are you a strong presenter? Do you organize teams well? Are you analytical or intuitive? And so when you get that list done, now you have a list of your hard skills and your soft skills. And so together, that's your toolkit that'll help you figure out how to pivot. Okay, now let's talk about narratives. So most people struggle to pivot because they don't know how to explain that change. So here's a template to use. I started in X activity or area because I was strong in Y, which is your strength. But I realized I care more about solving Z, which is why I'm moving towards next step. And the next step could be the little win we talked about, right? Finding a mentor or those sorts of things. So here's an example. I started in mechanical engineering because I'm good at systems thinking, but I realized I care more about how people use products. That's why I'm moving towards UX design, right? And so by framing it as a story, it becomes more real and concrete and makes it easier for you to interpolate all the other activities that make up this new version of you. Okay, now to the third step, which is rebuild, which is where you add new activities. This is where you solidify the pivot. You don't need another degree. And that's one thing that people freak out about. They're like, well, hey, I've been doing this thing my entire life, and now I'm like, I want to do something else now. Did I waste all that time? And the answer is you didn't, Don't throw that away. Keep that. That's actually what makes you unique. And a lot of times people are wondering, should they get another major or another degree of some sort? You don't always need to get another degree. A lot of times, if you can stack the right experience, you can pivot without spending thousands of dollars, right? Or you can do some self-study as well. Also, I would suggest, if you go work for a startup or a company that has you wearing more hats, you can gain these experiences on the job. And that's also common in a small company. So think creatively. You don't necessarily need to get another degree. And so here's some of my other ideas on how to rebuild and get experience to do that pivot. So the first thing you could do is take a course online or in person. It's a very common way, especially in certain fields. You'll see people go to boot camps, for example. Or you could join a project with the team in your new field. You could publish a piece of content on social media showing your thinking. That'll help you engage with other thinkers in the new area you're trying to enter into. You could shadow or intern somewhere for a few weeks. A couple others that aren't mentioned here. You could get a mentor. Honestly, just read a book on the subject. That helps. That'll give you a lot of condensed information and insight so you understand a little bit better what you're trying to get into. And so these sorts of things, they all add legitimacy to your shift without wiping away your history before you got here. And so those are the three big steps, right? So now you can kind of see, you recognize what you have, you narratize the story and the transition, and then you rebuild by doing more things that start to take you into this new identity. And then you rebuild where you add new activities as you work to become this new person. So all that being said, here's another thing that people really overlook when it comes to pivoting. Like you may think that pivoting is a very tough thing and it looks bad, but there's actually a hidden advantage that people who pivot have. And it's something that a lot of people miss. When you pivot, you bring a unique angle that insiders don't have. Like, for example, if you're a business person who understands tech, super valuable, right? Or a designer who knows something about finance, or an engineer who understands marketing, equally rare, right? So when you are able to live at the intersection of these different things, that uniqueness can actually become your differentiator. And there are certain companies that would love to have someone like that because they help bridge the gap between different functions. And a lot of times the people who are masters of more than one trade are able to actually be in leadership too, because they can see a little bit better how the pieces fit. So let's recap. When we're talking about pivoting, remember, you don't need to start over. You don't necessarily need to get a brand new degree. But what you do need to do is you need to recognize your assets. You need to narratize your transition. And then you need to rebuild with intent. And if you do this well, a pivot can give you way more leverage than the path you started out on.